first 7 verses there, it's dealing with the alliance with Egypt. And Isaiah, when you go back to verse 1, places a woe upon these rebellious children, which was Jerusalem, because they were not taking counsel of God, but they were seeking man's counsel. And going down to Egypt instead of asking from God or of God. And thus they were trusting in Egypt and Egypt's gods instead of trusting in the Lord. And so in verse 4, he says, "For his princes were at Zon, and his ambassadors came to Hanes." Someone turn over to Isaiah chapter 19 and read verse 11. Okay, the princes of Zon mentioned there. It is Tanis and is near the modern San El Hagar, is where it would be now. But it is basically a heap of ruins in the delta. Zon seems to be the place where Moses and Pharaoh had their struggle, if you can call it that, where Moses goes to Pharaoh and tells him, "Let the children of Israel go to worship God." In Psalm 78, in verse 12, and then in verse 43, it talks about marvelous things did he in the sight of their fathers, in the land of Egypt, in the field of Zon. Then in verse 43, how hath he wrought his signs in Egypt and his wonders in the field of Zon. So the psalmist seems to identify this town as where those things took place, which would be the struggle between Pharaoh and Moses. Probably where they lived. The Pharaoh and the elites of Egypt. An ambassador is an official representative of a foreign nation. Just kind of as an aside, ever hear of anyone saying that we as Christians are ambassadors for Christ? Well, they're wrong. We're not. Okay, it's the apostles that are the ambassadors of Christ. We are not official representatives of Christ. The apostles were. And Paul identifies himself as one and identifies the apostles as ambassadors. They are the ones who are speaking for that. In a physical sense, they're speaking for the king or our ambassadors to nations, they are speaking for the president.
That's why they have to be so careful what they say.
That's right.
For the United Nations, anytime they make a speech, they got to be very careful what they say.
They have to be very careful with what they say, because they are speaking for the president and the United States. The ambassadors serve at the pleasure of the president, is the way in which they word it, because they know that if there's a change in presidency, then what they have to do changes, and the new president may not want them because they kind of represented the old president. So they want to get rid of them. And so they fire them and put someone else in, because they serve at the pleasure of the president, because they are his official representative, his spokesman to that nation, or the rulers of that nation. With ambassadors for Christ, the apostles stood in that position. They were officially spokesmen for Christ. They were setting forth his law. They were being inspired by the Holy Spirit so they could speak that word and write it down for us inerrantly, without any errors or mistakes, and fully, totally. We can't do that. We have their record, but we're not ambassadors. Same thing. Witnessing, we have to witness for Christ. And that is so strongly ingrained in the denominational world that if you try and explain it, they have difficulty with even the concept, because the whole idea is, well, we're commanded to witness for Christ. No, that was the apostles were witnesses. You don't qualify to be a witness. We kind of dropped the first part of that, eyewitness. They had to be eyewitnesses, physically there seeing. That's one of the reasons that Jesus appeared to Saul on the road to Damascus. Wasn't to save him. It was to make him a witness that he had seen the resurrected Christ, and thus an apostle. But here's ambassadors, official representatives to Egypt. That's a witness. 1 John 1, verses 1 through 3. We've seen, we've heard, we've handled him. And so that's someone who is a witness. Ambassadors, that official representative, sent now to Zone and Hanes. These are apparently the leading cities of Egypt at the time. And they are being sent there for help and support. City of Hanes, where is it? Well, this is the only mention of this city in all of the Bible. You're probably correct upon that, but we don't know. Pulpit commentary states this about it. quote, Hanes has been generally identified as a modern Esnes, a village between Memphis and Thebes, which is thought to mark the site of Heracleopas Magna. But it has been well remarked that the Jewish envoys, which scarcely would have proceeded so far. Mr. R.S. Poole suggests instead of Esnes, Taphanes or Daphne, but that name is somewhat remote from Hanes. Perhaps it would be best to acknowledge that Hanes cannot at present be identified. It is probably not very far from Tanis, end quote. So, very basically, have no idea where it is, but we believe it's probably close to where Zone was. And that would make sense, but in reality, they don't know. Hezekiah was the king at this time. There's the question, did these ambassadors go on such a mission without his knowledge and his approval? They shouldn't have. Let me ask, today, do governmental officials, put it that way, ever do anything behind the back of the one who is the leader of a nation? Phyllis said, not supposed to. Well, that's true. They're not supposed to, but how many times does it happen? A lot of times. Could these ambassadors have gone to Egypt without Hezekiah, the king's knowledge and approval? It's a possibility. Even though it seems highly unlikely that they did. In all probability, they had Hezekiah's approval to go to Egypt for help. And yet, when you say that and you look at the life of Hezekiah, does that kind of correspond with his life? This means no, this means it doesn't really correspond with his life, does it? When Rabshakeh comes and defiles Jerusalem and God, what did Hezekiah do? Go to the prophet Isaiah and ask for God's help. When Isaiah tells him to set his house in order, for you're going to die and not live, what did he do? He turned and he prayed to God. And of course, God extended his life for 15 years. Now then, knowing things like that within his life, does it correspond to someone who would send an ambassadors down to Egypt for help? To me, it doesn't. And yet, an official representative of Israel is going to Egypt for help. Don't know whether Hezekiah actually sent them or not. I say, to me, it doesn't seem consistent with his life and what we read about him. But yet, here's his ambassadors. Uh, so it seems as if he probably did know about it. Okay, Dale?
It kind of confuses me a little bit. Maybe I shouldn't be confused. I mean, you would think that. I really shouldn't say that. It's kind of disrespectful for me to say it like that. Holy Spirit would explain it, but that's the way it is, though. These people don't always walk together. They're not always one. They're divided sometimes. So I guess all he's doing, Holy Spirit's doing, is explaining the reality, explaining the way the situation was. And we're supposed to take it that way.
Well, Isaiah, as he writes this, is stating the facts of what happened. There is an ambassadors that went there. He doesn't get and doesn't explain the reasons for it. It doesn't state that they were sent by Hezekiah, the king. Those are speculations which we would like to know, don't always know, because the Bible doesn't always reveal them. But as strong as Hezekiah was, a good king, I ask, do Christians ever have their faith wane at times? Oh yeah, they do, don't they? Probably we've all faced it at one time or another. Why would we think maybe Hezekiah didn't? And thus he allows these ambassadors to go. Prophets got scared, yeah. What about it? Yeah. What are you doing in this cave?
The impression that Uzziah didn't ask advice of the Lord whether you should go up against Nico or not. It seemed like he just went.
Well, he was actually told not to go,
Okay.
if I remember correctly. And he went anyway. Great victory by Elijah. Yeah. Jezebel says, I'm going to kill you. He gets scared and runs. And it's woe is me. I'm the only one. And God has to remind him there's 7,000 who have not bowed the knee to Baal.
There's a lot left out in there that we don't, that really happened to him.
We don't have all of the details a lot of times, but here's someone who is obviously very strong, who becomes very depressed, and his faith wanes at times.
I was thinking about Elijah, what happened. Something had to happen to cause him to change that.
Well, that's who I meant, yeah, Elijah. How long of a period of time between the victory at Mount Carmel and his running away? Doesn't seem to be much time, though. Peter, strong individual, but yet when he's outside of the palace and they say, aren't you one of Jesus' disciples? Oh no, not me. 3 times. And the 3rd time, how many think he cursed in relationship to using God's name in vain? No. It's not the meaning of the word. It says cursed, but it is it's basically like bringing a woe upon me. We would say, may the Lord strike me dead, type of an attitude. That's the idea of cursing, bringing a curse upon himself if what he says is false. Well, what he was saying was a lie. He was with Jesus and one of his disciples, and yet he was denying it. Okay. In fact, all of the apostles left. Judas is, to me, the Lord selected him. And yet, John describes him as a thief. And the idea is that's the way he had always been. And by the way, just as, how many times do you hear denominational people, if you're talking to them about once saved, always saved, that someone in Jesus' hand, no one can snatch them out of his hand. He has the power to keep them to the end, to save them. What about Judas? Judas was one of his. Jesus selected him. Did he fall? According to that view, he couldn't have. It was an impossibility for him to fall, and yet he did. Why? Well, because of weakness and because of sin. While no one can snatch them out of Jesus' hand, they can, on their own, choose to leave that place of safety. And that's the key there. They failed to recognize that aspect of it. Start with verse 5 then, Lord willing, next week.